The morning I walked into my accountant's office and asked him to restructure everything, he looked at me the way people look at someone who's just announced they're giving away a kidney. "Eunice," he said, setting down his pen, "are you absolutely certain about this?" I told him I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. He didn't ask again, but let me back up. Because to understand why I did what I did, you need to understand what happened at my son's engagement party. And to understand that, you need to know something about me. Something most people in my life, including my own son, never bothered to find out. I am 63 years old. I was born in Sault Ste. Eure. Marie, the second of 4 children, to a woman who cleaned other people's houses and a father who drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. We weren't poor in the way people romanticize. We didn't have warm bread on the table and love to spare. We were just short. Short on money, short on time, short on the kind of softness that comes when you're not worried about the hydro bill. My mother had a binder, green, cloth-covered, the kind you used to find at Zeller's before they closed. She kept it on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet, above the canned tomatoes. Inside were her recipes, not printed from anywhere, just written in her handwriting on whatever paper she had nearby. Index cards, the backs of envelopes, a torn page from a coil notebook. Cabbage rolls, tourtière, butter tarts. Her mother's shortbread, a soup she called Thursday soup because she made it every Thursday from whatever was left in the fridge. When I got married at 24, she gave me that binder. She'd added a section in the back, recipes she'd written specifically for me. Things she knew I loved. Things she thought I'd need. Her handwriting got a little shaky near the end of the section because her arthritis was bad that year, but she finished it. She pressed it into my hands at the kitchen table and said, "You'll use these." I did use them, every single one. My marriage lasted 11 years. My husband was not a bad man. He was just someone who needed more than I could give, or maybe less. We parted without cruelty, which I have always considered a small grace. Our son was 8 when we separated. I took a part-time bookkeeping position at a plumbing supply company. My son came with me to the office some afternoons. He did his homework at the corner desk while I reconciled invoices. Those years were not glamorous, but I paid attention. I watched how money moved, who had it, who lost it, and why. I started taking night courses, accounting, then real estate licensing. I bought my first property at 38, a 2-bedroom bungalow on a dead-end street in Sudbury that smelled like mildew and someone's old cigarettes. The inspector gave me a list of deficiencies 11 pages long. I fixed every single one. Not by myself. I'm not that handy. But I found the tradespeople. I managed the timeline. I held the budget. 9 months later, I rented it out. The rent covered the mortgage in 14 months. I bought another property, then another. I never told my son the specifics. He knew I worked in real estate. He knew I was doing okay. But I grew up in a house where you didn't talk about money, not because it was shameful, but because it was private. Numbers on a page weren't something you announced. They were something you built. By the time my son was in his 30s, I had 17 properties across northern Ontario. I had never once called myself wealthy. I drove a sensible car. I shopped at Superstore. I kept my mother's binder in the kitchen cabinet on the second shelf above the canned tomatoes. My son called me on a Tuesday in March to tell me he was engaged. Her name was Ashley. I'd met her twice. Once at Christmas dinner the year before, once briefly when I stopped by his apartment to drop off some paperwork. She was polished. That's the word that kept coming to me. Polished the way a surface is polished. Smooth, reflective, nothing underneath catching the light. She worked in financial communications, whatever that means, and she had the kind of confidence that comes not from having done anything difficult, but from never having been in a room where she wasn't immediately accommodated. I told my son I was happy for him. I meant it. The engagement dinner was held at a restaurant in North Bay, her family's choice. It was the kind of place with no prices on the menu and cloth napkins folded into little peaks. Her parents were already seated when I arrived. Her mother stood to greet me. Her name was Vivian. Not Vivian anything, just Vivian. The way she introduced herself made clear that the last name was unnecessary. She had hair the color of champagne and earrings that were probably real. "You must be Eunice," she said in a tone that managed to be both warm and slightly surprised, as though she'd expected someone different. Her husband shook my hand without standing up. I sat down. There was a small card on the table with my name on it, and next to it, in parentheses, the word groom's mother. Not my name, the category. We ordered. The conversation flowed the way it does when two families don't actually know each other. Questions about weather, about the drive, about how long the restaurant had been open. Her father mentioned their cottage on Lake Muskoka twice. Her mother mentioned their daughter's upcoming trip to Portugal. Nobody asked me anything about myself except my son, once, who said, "How's work going, Mom?" And I said, "Fine," because that's what you say. The food came. The evening moved forward. After the main course, I reached into my bag and brought out the gift I'd prepared. It wasn't wrapped elaborately. It was my mother's binder, the green one, and beside it, a second binder I had made myself, over the course of 4 months. I'd gone through everything my mother left me, and I carefully copied her recipes, in my own handwriting, not printed, not typed onto good quality cardstock. I'd organized them by season, by occasion, by the kind of day you were having. On the inside cover, I'd written a note to my son and his fiancé. I'd included 3 recipes of my own that I'd developed over the years. I'd tucked in a photograph of my mother at her kitchen table and one of my son at age 9, sitting on the counter while I made Thursday soup. I slid it across the table to them. My son opened it. He looked at the first page. He smiled. A real smile, not a polished one. He said, "Mom, this is incredible." That was the last thing he said, because Vivian leaned over to look and something shifted in her expression. She picked up the edge of the binder the way you might pick up something you found on the sidewalk. She turned a few pages, and then she looked at her daughter and said with a little laugh, the kind that's designed to sound like an aside but carry across the table, "How darling! A handmade cookbook! How very homespun!" Her daughter laughed too. Not unkindly exactly. The way you laugh when your mother laughs and you haven't thought fast enough to decide not to. Her husband said nothing. He was cutting his steak. I looked at my son. He was looking at the tablecloth. I waited 3 seconds, 5, 10, long enough that it became a choice. His silence became a decision, not just a pause. I picked up my napkin. I folded it. I placed it beside my plate. I reached across the table and I took both binders back, gently, without making a scene. My son's head came up then, but I was already putting them in my bag. I said, "Thank you for the lovely dinner." I set it to the table. Then I put on my coat, picked up my bag, and walked out of the restaurant. It was a cold night, April in northern Ontario, the kind of cold that's almost theatrical, all that promise of spring, and then the temperature just drops anyway. I sat in my car for a few minutes in the parking lot. I wasn't crying. I was thinking. I was thinking about my mother's handwriting on those index cards. I was thinking about my son's face when he looked at the tablecloth. I called my accountant in the morning. He came to my kitchen, his choice. He always preferred the kitchen. And I made coffee and I told him what I wanted to do. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about him. "You want to transfer everything into a family trust?" he said. "Yes." "With yourself as the sole trustee?" "Yes." "And remove your son as the named beneficiary?" "For now," I said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Eunice, he doesn't know what you have, does he?" It wasn't really a question. "No," I said. "He doesn't." Here's what my son thought about his mother. He thought she was a bookkeeper who got into real estate later in life and done reasonably well. He thought she drove a sensible car because she was practical. He thought she shopped at Superstore because she was frugal. He thought the house I lived in, a nice but unremarkable split level in a quiet neighborhood, was the extent of what I had. He had never asked me. and I had never volunteered it because it never seemed like the right time. And then it seemed like he should have asked, and then so much time passed that I just assumed it didn't matter to him. I have 17 rental properties. I have 2 commercial units. I have a portfolio that my accountant manages with calm professional competence and the occasional raised eyebrow. I am not a billionaire. I am not even close. But I am the kind of woman who, if her son's future mother-in-law had looked her up, would not have seemed like someone you could dismiss with the phrase, "how homespun." None of that is why I walked out of the restaurant. I want to be clear about that. I didn't leave because I was insulted on behalf of my net worth. I left because my son watched a woman reduce his mother to a punchline, and he chose the tablecloth. I've thought about it a lot since then. I've tried to be fair. He was in an uncomfortable position. He didn't want to start a scene at an engagement dinner. He was probably hoping it would pass. Maybe he told himself I didn't notice. But I noticed, and he knew I noticed, and he chose the tablecloth anyway. A few days after the dinner, he called me. I let it ring twice, then answered. "Mom," he said, "about the other night." "Yes," I said. "Vivian can be a lot. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." "I understand," I said. "Are you okay?" I told him I was fine, because I was. I wasn't falling apart. I wasn't furious in the way that makes you shake. I was just very, very clear. I said, "I took the binders back." He paused. I noticed. "I was going to talk to you about that." "They belong with me," I said. "For now." He didn't push it. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular. A hockey game, a neighbor's dog, the weather. Before we hung up, he said, "I love you, Mom." And I said it back, because I meant it, and meaning it doesn't change what I decided. My accountant finished the restructuring 3 weeks later. Everything is now held in trust. I am the trustee. The beneficiary documents are blank pending future designation. My son is not named. He is not excluded permanently. I want to be clear about that too. But right now, in this season of his life, he is learning something. I'm not sure he knows he's learning it yet. I kept both binders. On a Saturday in May, I made Thursday soup. I followed my mother's recipe exactly, the one written on the back of a hydro envelope. Her handwriting slightly slanted because she was left-handed and always tried to write too fast. Leek and potato and barley with whatever sad vegetables are left in the crisper. She used to say the soup tasted better when the fridge was almost empty because then you couldn't leave anything out. I sat at my kitchen table and ate it, and I thought about the photograph I'd tucked into the back of the binder. My son at 9 years old, sitting on the counter in his socks, his hair doing that thing it used to do in the back. He was watching me stir the pot. His expression was the one children have when they're watching something that seems almost magical. Not because it is magical, but because the person doing it belongs entirely to them. He belonged to me that day, and I belonged to him. I don't know if Vivian's daughter will be a good wife to my son. I don't know if my son will become the man I raised him to be, or the man that table seemed to suggest he was becoming. I don't know a lot of things. What I know is this. My mother handed me something at a kitchen table when I was 24 years old. She pressed it into my hands and said, "You'll use these." She meant the recipes, but she also meant everything else. The discipline, the patience, the understanding that the things worth having take time and do not announce themselves. I use them, every single one. The binders are on the second shelf of my kitchen cabinet, above the canned tomatoes. They'll stay there until someone earns them. The soup was very good. If you've ever given someone your whole heart, your history, your mother's handwriting, a photograph of who you used to be, and watched them treat it like a footnote, I want you to know something. You are allowed to take it back. You are allowed to walk out of the restaurant. You are allowed to sit in your car in a cold parking lot in April and be completely, quietly certain. And then you are allowed to go home and make soup and be at peace with what you decided. I'll tell you what happens next in the comments if you want to know. But I suspect some of you already do. People ask me sometimes, not directly, but in the way people circle a question they're not sure they're allowed to ask, whether I regret it. Whether I think I was too hard on my son, whether walking out of that restaurant and everything that followed was an overreaction from a woman who was tired and hurt and maybe reading too much into one uncomfortable evening. I don't think that, but I understand why they wonder. Here's what I've come to believe, not from any book or teaching, but from 63 years of watching how things actually unfold. The choices we make in small moments are never really small. Vivienne's comment about my mother's binder being homespun that took maybe 4 seconds to say. My son's silence took maybe 10, but those seconds had weight behind them, the accumulated weight of what a person decides they are and what they decide matters. You don't arrive at that kind of dismissal by accident. And you don't arrive at that kind of silence by accident either. I raised my son to be decent. I believe I did. But decency isn't something you install in a child and then step back from. It's something they have to choose over and over, in rooms you're not in, at tables where it cost them something. That night at the restaurant cost him something to stay quiet. I know that. I'm not pretending it didn't. But he paid that cost anyway, and I think he needs to understand what he paid it for. What I did the next morning, calling my accountant, restructuring everything, wasn't punishment. I want to be honest about that. Even here, even with myself, it wasn't about the money. It was about clarity. I had spent 30 years building something in silence, and it occurred to me, sitting in my car in that parking lot in April, that silence can become a kind of negligence. My son didn't know who his mother was. Not really, and some part of that is on me. So I decided to stop being silent. Not loudly. I didn't make a scene. I didn't send a letter. I didn't call anyone to explain myself. I just made a decision about my own life and my own work, and I let it stand there. My mother used to say, not as a lesson, just as an observation, the way she said most things, that you can tell a lot about a person by what they protect, not what they say they value, what they actually protect when something asks them to choose. She was talking about her recipes once, I think, about why she kept copying them down even when the binders got full and the kitchen was crowded. But I've thought about it in bigger terms since then. Ashley's mother protects her image. Her daughter protects her comfort. My son, that night, protected the piece of a table he was sitting at. I protected a green cloth binder with my mother's handwriting on index cards. I think I made the right choice. And I think, if my son is the person I believe him to be somewhere underneath all this, he'll eventually understand what he lost access to that evening. And it won't be the properties. It'll be the version of his mother who is willing to hand him her whole history without being asked. That version is still here. She's just waiting on the second shelf above the canned tomatoes for someone to earn her. The morning I called my accountant, it was still dark outside. I remember standing at the kitchen window with my coffee going cold in my hand, watching the streetlight flicker on the snow. It was February. That particular kind of February that makes you feel like winter will never end. I'd been up since 4, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I'd already made my decision and there was nothing left to do but wait for business hours. My accountant picked up on the second ring. He always does. "Audrey," he said. And I could hear him sit up straighter even through the phone. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" I told him I was. I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. Let me back up. Because if I start there, at the phone call, you won't understand why. My name is Audrey Sinclair. I'm 63 years old. I live alone in a house I own in Oakville, Ontario, about 40 minutes outside Toronto, depending on traffic. I have a son named Christopher. He's 31. He works in finance, investment management, Bay Street, the whole thing. I'm proud of him. I was proud of him. I'm still working out the difference. His fiancé's name is Portia. I want to be fair when I describe her, so I'll say this. She's intelligent, she's organized, and she has very clear ideas about how the world should be arranged. I found all of this out over the course of a single evening last November at a dinner I was not entirely prepared for. They'd been together 2 years. I'd met Portia maybe 4 or 5 times, always briefly, always in situations where conversations stayed shallow. I knew her family was from Rosedale. I knew her father did something in real estate development. I knew she'd gone to Upper Canada College, then McGill, then straight into a consulting firm where she'd done very well. Christopher told me these things with a kind of reverence that I noted and said nothing about. The engagement dinner was held at her parents' home. I didn't know that until the week before. I'd assumed, I think reasonably, that it would be a restaurant, something neutral, somewhere we could all get to know each other properly. Instead, I drove up to a house in Forest Hill on a Saturday evening in November with a bottle of wine I'd chosen carefully and a gift I'd been working on for months. The gift was a quilt. I should explain the quilt because that's the whole story, really. Everything else is just furniture around it. I learned to quilt from my mother, who learned from hers. My grandmother came to Canada from Scotland in 1952 with almost nothing. Some clothes, a tin of shortbread, and a box of fabric scraps she'd been collecting since she was a girl. She made quilts her entire life. When my mother married, my grandmother stayed up 3 nights running to finish a wedding quilt in time. She hand-stitched every seam. On the back, in small, careful letters, she embroidered the date and a single line. What is made with love holds longer than what is bought. When I got married, my mother made me a quilt. Same tradition. When Christopher was born, I started collecting fabric. Small squares from his first sleeper, from the curtains in his nursery, from a shirt of his father's that wore out at the elbows, but that nobody could bear to throw away. His father died when Christopher was 12. Cancer, fast, the kind that doesn't negotiate. I kept collecting fabric after that. A square from the tie Christopher wore to his first job interview. A piece of the jersey from his hockey team. I'd been quietly working on that quilt for 3 years by the time of the engagement dinner, adding to it, replanning it when I learned Portia's colors, stitching her initials alongside Christopher's in the center panel. It was the most personal thing I could have given them. I wrapped it in tissue paper and tied it with a ribbon. I put it in a plain cotton bag because it was too big for a box. Portia's mother, Georgina, met me at the door. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of champagne. She looked at my coat, a good wool coat but a few years old, and smiled the way people smile when they're deciding something about you. "You must be Christopher's mom," she said. "How lovely. Come in, come in. We're just in the drawing room, Right. There were 12 people at dinner. Portia's parents, her younger sister, and her husband, 2 sets of family friends, Christopher, Portia, me, and an older woman named Constance, who I gathered was Georgina's mother, though she was seated at the far end and we never properly spoke. I was placed between one of the family friends, a man who worked in private equity and wanted to talk about the housing market, and an empty chair that eventually belonged to Georgina's brother, who arrived late and smelled strongly of something expensive. Christopher was across the table. He smiled at me when I sat down. It was a nervous smile. I recognized it. I'd seen it on his face before tests, before hockey tryouts, before difficult conversations. I smiled back and told myself it would be fine. The wine was very good. The food was catered, though Georgina mentioned twice that she'd directed the menu. I ate and listened and answered questions. What do? I told them I'd worked in healthcare administration for many years and had recently retired. This was true. The private equity man nodded politely and returned to the housing market. When the dessert plates were cleared, Georgina announced that it was time for gifts. This was apparently a tradition in their family. Gifts opened at the table in front of everyone. Christopher and Portia sat at the head of the table. There were several gifts in front of them. I could see the edges of envelopes and what looked like a jewelry box in distinctive teal packaging. I handed Christopher the cotton bag. "This is from me," I said. "I made it." Portia reached in first. She pulled out the quilt, just a corner of it at first, and then more, and then the whole thing unfolded across her lap and onto the floor, and I watched her face. And I watched Georgina's face. Portia said, "Oh," not warmly. Just, "Oh," as if she'd opened a cupboard and found something she didn't expect. Georgina leaned over. She looked at the quilt. Then she looked at me. Then she looked back at Portia, and she laughed, a light, bright little laugh, very practiced. And she said, "How charming. A handmade quilt. That's so old-fashioned, isn't it?" She said it like a compliment skinned and turned inside out. "A little heirloom piece. Lovely. Portia folded it back up. Not carefully. She thanked me. She moved on to the teal box. I sat very still. Christopher said nothing. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. He was sitting right there. He saw exactly what happened. He knows what that quilt is. He knows the fabric from his father's shirt is in there. He knows it took me 3 years. He said nothing. He watched his fiancé fold it carelessly and set it aside, and he turned his attention to the next gift, and he laughed at something Portia's father said, and he did not once look at me. Later, after the conversation moved on, after I'd smiled through another 40 minutes of polite nothing, Georgina stopped me in the hallway while I was getting my coat. "It was so sweet of you to make something," she said. She touched my arm. "Truly. I know you must have put a lot of effort in." The way she said effort, like effort was its own kind of apology for not having money. "It was a pleasure," I said, and I meant it, actually. I just no longer meant it for the reason I'd thought I did. I drove home through the snow, and I sat in my driveway for a while without going inside. The radio was off. I thought about my mother and my grandmother and the line on the back of the quilt. "What is made with love holds longer than what is bought." I thought about Christopher's face. Then I went inside and I called my sister, and she listened and she said what I needed to hear, which was nothing. She just stayed on the line while I had a cup of tea. Now, here's the part of the story that they didn't know. Nobody at that dinner, not Georgina, not her husband, not Portia, and not Christopher, because I had never told him directly, knew anything real about my financial situation. I'd always been private about money. I grew up in a house where you didn't discuss it. You didn't borrow, you didn't complain, and you absolutely did not show it. My parents were the kind of people who drove the same car for 20 years and then quietly owned 3 rental properties. I learned from them. When I was in my early 40s, I started buying property. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that made headlines. A small duplex in Hamilton when prices were still reasonable. Then a house in Kitchener that I renovated slowly over 2 years on weekends. Then another. I worked in hospital administration during the week, and I read everything I could find about property management at night. I made mistakes, one in particular involving a contractor in Guelph that I still don't enjoy thinking about, and I learned from them and I kept going. By the time I retired, I held 7 properties, all of them tenanted, all of them generating steady rental income. My financial advisor, the one I've been working with for 19 years, had also helped me build an investment portfolio that had done quietly, stubbornly well over 2 decades of compound growth. I was not what anyone would call flashy. I drove a sensible car. My coat was a few years old. I had a house in Oakville that I'd paid off in 2019, and that had since more than doubled in assessed value. I was comfortable, significantly more than comfortable. But I never talked about it because it never seemed like the right thing to talk about. Christopher knew I owned some rental property. He didn't know how much, or what it was worth, or what my portfolio looked like. He'd never asked. Not once. In all his years working in finance, in a job where he spent every day thinking about other people's money, had he ever sat down with me and asked how I was managing mine. I don't know what that says. I've thought about it a lot. The week after the engagement dinner, I called my accountant, and then I called my lawyer. I want to be clear that I didn't do what I did out of spite, or not only out of spite. I did it because I'd been sitting with something uncomfortable for a long time, and that dinner brought it into focus. The quilt was just the occasion. The question underneath it was older. What do you do when you realize that the person you raised doesn't know who you are? That he's looked at you his whole life and seen something smaller than what's actually there. And not because you hid yourself, but because he never bothered to look? I told myself it didn't matter. Lots of mothers tell themselves that. I told myself he was busy. He was building his life. This is what it looks like when your children become adults. But there is a difference between becoming an adult and watching someone mock your mother's 3-year labor of love and saying nothing. Saying nothing. Across the table from me. So I called my accountant and I told him I wanted to restructure. Not everything, but significantly, I wanted to establish a charitable trust. I'd been thinking about this for a while, actually, a women's shelter in Hamilton that I'd been donating to quietly for years, and that was badly underfunded. I wanted to direct a portion of the rental income there on an ongoing basis, formalized, legal, not reversible on a whim. I wanted to review the estate plan. I wanted to understand my options clearly. I wasn't disinheriting Christopher. I wasn't doing anything that dramatic, but I was done leaving things vague on the assumption that he'd be there, paying attention, caring about the details. I wanted things written down the way I actually meant them, not the way they'd been left, which was the way they'd been left by default because I'd always assumed there would be more time. My accountant, who has known me since Christopher was in elementary school, said, "Are you doing this because you're angry?" I said, "I'm doing this because I'm clear." He helped me get it done. Christopher called 3 weeks later. I don't know what prompted it. Maybe Portia had said something, or maybe he'd noticed the shift in my manner over the holidays, which were quieter than usual. I'd gone to their place for Christmas Eve. I'd brought shortbread I'd made from my grandmother's recipe. Nobody commented on it. He called on a Tuesday evening in January. "Mom," he said, "can we talk? I feel like something's off." I told him to come for dinner on Saturday. I made soup, a good soup. Chicken, the kind that takes most of the day. He sat at my kitchen table the way he used to as a child, elbows on the table, watching me move around. Something about the familiarity of it made my chest ache. I didn't bring up the dinner. I let him. He got there eventually. He said he thought maybe the dinner had been uncomfortable. He said Portia's family had a particular way about them, very formal, and he hoped I hadn't taken anything the wrong way. I put down the ladle and I turned around. "Christopher," I said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I'd like you to listen without explaining." He listened. I told him what the quilt was, not the summary, the whole thing, the fabric from his father's shirt, the 3 years. The fact that I'd pulled out seams and redone them because the tension wasn't right. The line from his great-grandmother on the back. I told him that I watched him say nothing, that it wasn't really about Georgina's comment. I met Georgina's before. The world is full of them. But about the fact that he was sitting across from me and he chose to let it go. That he had never, in 31 years, been curious enough to ask me how I was actually doing. Not financially. I didn't even mean financially. Just how I was doing. What I thought about, what I'd built, who I was when he wasn't in the room. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What have you built?" And I told him, not to prove anything, not to shock him. I told him because he finally asked, and I was done keeping it to myself out of a habit of privacy that had never actually served me. I watched his face change as I talked. He's good with numbers, finance, Bay Street, all of it. So he understood what I was saying immediately. He understood the properties, the portfolio, the trust. He sat very still. When I finished, he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "I was waiting for you to be curious." He didn't have an answer to that. We ate the soup. He helped with the dishes. Before he left, he stood in the hallway for a moment, and then he asked if he could see the quilt. I'd kept it. I hadn't given it back. I'd quietly retrieved the bag before I left the engagement dinner, while people were saying their goodbyes in the front hallway, and nobody had mentioned it since or asked where it went. I brought it out and unfolded it on the living room floor. He crouched down and looked at it for a long time. He found the square from his father's shirt without me pointing it out. His father had worn that shirt to every one of Christopher's hockey games for 2 seasons. It was a particular plaid. Christopher ran his thumb along the edge of it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I don't know what happens next with the wedding. That's not my business to tell you. That's his life and hers, and I've said what needed saying. What I know is that the trust is set up, the estate plan is updated, and the women's shelter in Hamilton is getting a new furnace this spring, and a part-time outreach coordinator funded through to 2028. That feels like something real. I also know that Christopher now calls me every Sunday. Not every second Sunday, not when he remembers, every Sunday, without fail. We talk about actual things. He asked me last week about the Kitchener property and whether I'd ever thought about selling. We talked for an hour. It was the longest real conversation we'd had in years. I still have the quilt. It's folded on the chest at the foot of my bed. The center panel has both their initials, Christopher's and Portia's, stitched together. I haven't taken Portia's out. I'm not sure what I'll do with it eventually. Maybe I'll give it to them anyway. When enough time has passed, maybe I'll make something else. My grandmother would probably say the making was the point, that the object only holds the meaning you put into it, and the meaning doesn't disappear just because someone failed to see it. She was right about most things. If you've ever made something with your hands and had someone treat it like it was nothing, I imagine you know the particular sting of that. It's not quite like any other kind of hurt. It lives in your palm somehow. I'd like to know if this has happened to you. Tell me in the comments. And if you've stayed this long, thank you. That means something to me, genuinely. Your time is not nothing. It never is. I've been thinking about what I actually learned from all of this. Not the lesson you'd put on a greeting card, not stand up for yourself or know your worth. Something quieter than that and less comfortable. What I learned is that silence has a cost. Not just Christopher's silence at that table, though that one I'll be sitting with for a long time. My own silence too. 31 years of privacy that I told myself was dignity, but that was also, if I'm honest, a kind of withholding. I never showed him what I'd built because I didn't want to seem like I was bragging. But somewhere in there, without meaning to, I also never showed him who I was. You can't expect someone to value what they've never been allowed to see. That's on me. I own that. And Christopher, I don't think he's a bad person. I think he's someone who got comfortable, who looked at his mother and saw the soup and the shortbread and the sensible coat and stopped looking. It's easy to do with people who've always been there. We do it with the things we love most sometimes. We stop seeing them clearly because we assume they'll always be in the same place, unchanged, available. What Georgina did that night at the dinner table was unkind. But it wasn't the wound. The wound was Christopher, sitting across from me and choosing the easier thing. That's the moment I keep returning to. Not with anger anymore, mostly with something closer to grief, and underneath the grief, something that feels like clarity. Here's what I've come to understand. The people who build things quietly, who get up before dawn, who learn things the hard way, who make mistakes and absorb them and keep going without announcing any of it. Those people often end up invisible to the people closest to them, not because they're not seen, but because they made it look too easy. Steadiness gets mistaken for simplicity. Capability gets mistaken for contentment. I'm not saying make your struggles louder. I'm saying that if you love someone, be curious about them. Actually curious. Ask the questions. Not because you'll inherit something, not because it's useful, just because they're a person who has lived a whole life, and that life is worth knowing about. Your mother. Your father. The older woman at the end of the table you never quite got around to speaking to. Ask. The quilt is still at the foot of my bed. I look at it every morning. The square from my late husband's plaid shirt is in the third row from the top, right of center, and some mornings I can look at it without the ache, and some mornings I can't. That's just how it is with things that hold a lot of meaning. They don't get lighter. You just get stronger. I'm 63. I have properties to manage and a trust that's doing something real in the world. I have a son who calls every Sunday now. I have shortbread in the tin on my counter that I made from my grandmother's recipe, and I have a life I built, quietly on my own terms. That's enough. It's more than enough. It turns out the things you make with your hands really do hold longer than the things you buy. My grandmother was right about that, and about most things. I just had to get to this particular November to understand it properly. The morning after my daughter's engagement party, I sat in my car outside my accountant's office for 11 minutes before I went in. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard. I wasn't crying. I was done crying. I was just trying to remember how to be a person who walks through doors and sits in chairs and speaks in full sentences because the night before had taken something out of me that I wasn't sure I'd get back. Gerald. That's my accountant, Gerald Fitch, who has handled my books for going on 19 years, looked up when I walked in and immediately knew something was wrong. He seen me through my husband's death. He seen me through the flood that took out my studio in 2011. He knows my face, the way you know a road you've driven 1,000 times. He said, "Sit down, Miriam." I sat. And then I told him what I needed to do, and he looked at me for a long moment over the top of his reading glasses and said, "Are you absolutely certain about this?" I told him I was, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you're 63 and something shakes you hard enough. You start from the wound instead of the beginning. Let me go back. I have been a seamstress my entire adult life. Not a fashion designer, not a boutique owner, a seamstress. I want to be clear about that because the distinction matters to the kind of people I'm about to tell you about. It mattered enormously to them, and it mattered in exactly the wrong direction. I started sewing when I was 14 in the basement of my mother's house in Sudbury, Ontario. She had an old singer that she'd inherited from her own mother, and she taught me how to read a pattern the same way some mothers teach their daughters to read music. By the time I was in my 20s, I was taking in alterations and custom work out of a spare bedroom in my apartment in Ottawa. By my late 30s, I had a proper studio. By the time I turned 50, I had built something real, a small atelier that did bridal and formal wear, mostly referrals, mostly word of mouth, with a client list that stretched from Ottawa to Halifax and occasionally beyond. I never advertised. I never needed to. In this business, if your work is good, it travels on its own. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is, fully and completely. Even tonight, when I am still so angry I can barely write her name. Grew up watching me work. She knew the smell of a steam seam. She knew how to hold pins between her lips without swallowing them. She knew that the last fitting before a wedding was sacred, that a bride in that room was not a customer, but a person on the edge of something enormous, and that my job was to make her feel like herself, only more so. My daughter grew up knowing all of this, and then she got engaged to a man named, I'll call him my son-in-law because whatever else he is, that's what he's become, whose family did not know any of it, or rather, they knew it and decided it was not impressive. His mother. That's who I need to tell you about. His mother's name is Cecily Drummond Park. She is the kind of woman who introduces herself with her full name and waits for you to recognize it. She and her husband, a corporate lawyer, retired, very pleased about it, live in a very large house in Rockcliffe Park in Ottawa, which, if you don't know Ottawa, is the kind of neighborhood where the houses have names. Their house is called Thornfield. They have a sign. I am not making this up. I knew about Cecily before I met her. My daughter had told me enough. I knew she had opinions about caterers and seating arrangements and the difference between ivory and cream in a way that suggested she had never once considered that other people might have opinions too. I knew she had asked, when the engagement was announced, whether my daughter's family would be comfortable with the venue she had in mind. Comfortable, as if we were guests at our own children's wedding. I decided before I ever shook Cecily's hand that I would be generous. I would be open. I would give her every chance to be a decent person because my daughter loved her son, and that had to mean something. So I made a gift. I want to tell you about this gift carefully because it matters. It is the center of everything. For 31 years, I kept a workbook, not a journal. A workbook. It was a large binder, the kind with the heavy cardstock cover, and over the decades the spine had softened and the cover had worn to the texture of old suede. Inside it, I had kept everything. Fabric swatches from significant gowns, sketches, my sketches done in pencil and sometimes in colored marker when I wanted to remember a particular detail. Notes to myself about clients, about fittings, about problems I'd solved and techniques I'd worked out through trial and error. Photographs, some of them Polaroids from the early days, of finished work laid out on my cutting table. And mixed in throughout, handwritten on index cards that I'd taped to the pages, my methods. Not just for sewing, for everything. How to talk to a nervous bride. How to handle a mother of the bride who thinks she's the one getting married, how I pressed a stubborn French seam, how I cut bias on a difficult crepe without losing my mind, how I built a bodice that could support a woman's weight without boning. 40 years of knowing in my own handwriting, in a binder that smelled faintly of the lavender sachets I kept in my studio. I had always planned to give it to my daughter one day. She had inherited my eye for fabric and my patience for detail, even if she'd chosen a different career. I thought the workbook might mean something to her the way my mother's singer had meant something to me, not as a tool necessarily, but as a record, as proof that a life of careful, skilled work was worth documenting. I decided that the engagement party would be the right moment. A beginning, something she could carry forward. I wrapped it in tissue paper and tied it with ribbon, not elaborate, just neat, and I brought it to the dinner. The dinner was held at Cecily and her husband's home, Thornfield. There were about 30 people there, mostly from his side, a few from mine. The dining room had a long table and a chandelier and place cards in little brass holders. I found my seat near the far end, not near my daughter, and I set the wrapped binder beside my bread plate and I waited. Cecily moved through the room the way people do when it's their room, and they know it. She greeted her friends with both hands on their arms. She directed the caterers with a tilt of her head. She came to me eventually and shook my hand and said it was lovely to finally meet me, and her eyes moved past my shoulder before she finished a sentence. After dinner, there were toasts, and then my daughter opened gifts. She opened an envelope from her future in-laws first, a check, I learned later, for a significant sum toward the wedding, which was presented with the satisfied air of people who believe money is a language everyone understands. Then a set of crystal from an aunt. Then some things from friends. Then she got to mine. She knew what it was before she fully unwrapped it. I watched her face change when she felt the weight of it, when she saw the worn cover. She looked up at me across the table, and her eyes went soft, and she said, "Mum." And Cecily, who was sitting 3 chairs away and apparently felt no particular need to wait to be included in the moment, leaned forward and said, "What is it?" My daughter told her. A workbook, her mother's, from 30 years of her career. Cecily looked at it, then she looked at me. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that has a blade in it, and she said, "How darling." A little craft book. She set it to the table. Not to me, not to my daughter, to the table, to the room, as if it were an observation about the weather. Nobody said anything. I looked at my daughter. My daughter was looking at the binder. Cecily picked up her wine glass. "I'm sure it's very sweet." And my son-in-law, who had been right there, who had heard every word, laughed, not cruelly, just the way people laugh when they're nervous and they choose the wrong side without realizing they've chosen. A small laugh. An apologetic laugh that was somehow worse than anything else that happened that night. My daughter still didn't look at me. I excused myself 10 minutes later. I said I had an early morning, which was true. I got my coat from the front closet myself because nobody came to get it for me. I picked up the binder from where my daughter had set it on the gift table, and I put it under my arm and I walked out. I don't think Cecily noticed I'd taken it back. I don't think she noticed me leave. In my car, I sat with the binder in my lap, and I put my hands flat on the worn cover, and I stayed there for a while. The neighborhood was very quiet. The street was lined with maples that were just starting to come in for spring. Those first pale leaves that look almost tentative, like they're not sure yet. I drove home. I made tea. I did not sleep. The next morning, I called Gerald. What I needed to do involved my studio building. I own it, have owned it outright for 11 years, purchased it originally in 2003 with a mortgage that I paid off in what my bank manager at the time called an aggressive but impressive timeline. It's a 3-story Victorian on a side street in the Glebe, one of the original commercial properties on that block. Ground floor is my studio. Second floor I've rented out to a graphic designer named, I'll call her my tenant. She's a good tenant. None of this is her problem for the past 6 years. Third floor is a small apartment that I have rented for the past 8 years to a couple who are quiet and keep their section of the staircase clean and always pay before the first of the month. The building generates reliable income. Gerald had suggested more than once that I consider purchasing a second property, that the building's value had appreciated considerably, that I was in an excellent position. I had always said I'd think about it. What I told Gerald that morning was that I wanted to put the building on the market. He said, "Are you absolutely certain about this?" I said I was. He said, "Miriam, this is your primary income source, and the market in the glebe right now, you do well, very well, but once it's gone." I said I understood that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does this have to do with the dinner last night?" Gerald has known me for 19 years. I said it had to do with a great many things and that the dinner had clarified some of them. Here is what I did not tell Gerald, because I had not fully worked it out yet myself. Part of what Cecily's comment had done, that little "How darling," a little craft book delivered to a room full of people who then said nothing, was make me look at my own life from the outside. The way she had looked at it, as something small, as something that could be dismissed in 6 words by a woman who had never once made anything with her hands. And when I looked at my life from that angle, what I saw was not smallness. What I saw was 31 years of a workbook that had never needed to impress anyone. What I saw was a building I owned, free and clear, that I had purchased with money I had made by being very good at a skilled trade. What I saw was a client list that reached from Ottawa to Halifax, clients who called me before their daughters' weddings and their own, clients whose mothers had been clients, clients who sent Christmas cards. What I saw was a life that Cecily Drummond Park had called darling without knowing a single thing about it. And what I understood, sitting across from Gerald in his office, was that I was 63 years old and I had been modest my entire life, not because I doubted myself, but because I thought modesty was courteous. I had never needed anyone to know what I had built. It had been enough to know it myself. But I had handed my daughter the evidence of everything I was, the most personal thing I owned, and she had set it on a gift table and looked away, and the man she was going to marry had laughed. And so I listed the building. I want to be fair. My daughter called me the next day. She apologized. She said, Cecily had a way of speaking before she thought, that it hadn't meant anything, that the gift had been beautiful and she was sorry she hadn't said so in the moment. I listened to all of it. I said, I know you're sorry, sweetheart. She said, are you angry with me? I said, I'm sad for you. There's a difference. She didn't understand what I meant. I think she thought I meant I was sad on her behalf, about the evening, about Cecily. But what I meant was that I was sad because I had watched her look away. Because in the moment when someone had diminished something that had cost me a great deal of myself, she had looked at the binder instead of at me. I had been a single mother for most of her childhood. My husband left when she was 4. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just gradually and then completely the way some men do. I had built everything after that by myself. The alterations, the studio, the building, the workbook. I had never complained about it because there was nothing to complain about. It was just work, and I was glad to have it. But she had grown up in a house where work was simply something her mother did quietly and competently in the next room. And I understood, sitting with my tea the morning after I listed the building, that perhaps I had made it look too easy. Perhaps the absence of complaint had been its own kind of silence. I had given her the workbook to correct that silence, to say, here, this is what it was, all of it. And she had set it on a gift table. The building sold in 6 weeks at a number I will not disclose out of both privacy and a lifelong distaste for people who announce what they're worth. I will say it was a very good number. Gerald called me when the offer came in and said, Miriam, in a tone that contained several sentences. I told him to proceed. What I did with the money is my own business, and most of it is. But one part of it I will tell you because it's relevant. There is a small community organization in Ottawa. I won't name them specifically, but they work with women who are transitioning out of difficult situations and trying to establish themselves in trades and skilled work. Suing, alterations, small upholstery repairs, that kind of thing. They had been looking for a space for several years, something permanent, something they could train in without worrying about their lease. I had been aware of them for a long time. I had donated fabric and equipment occasionally. I knew their director, a woman I've had coffee with twice, who has more energy than anyone I've ever met. I called her the week after the sale closed. I told her I had some resources I wanted to direct her way. We met and we talked for 3 hours, and by the end of it, we had the outline of an arrangement, a significant donation, with provisions for a dedicated training space, named not for me, but for my mother, whose singer had started all of this. The director cried a little. I did not, but it was close. My daughter found out about the sale approximately 3 weeks after it closed through the Glebe Community Newsletter of all things, which mentioned the building's sale and upcoming use. She called me, and her voice was different from the voice she'd used when she apologized. Less managed, more genuine. She said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I said I hadn't thought it was necessary to announce. She said, "That building was..." "Mom, I grew up around that building." I said, "I know." There was a long quiet on the phone, and I let it be quiet because I'm 63 and I've learned that not every silence needs to be filled. She said, "I should have said something." At the dinner, when she said that, "I should have said something." I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't know what to say." I said, "You could have said anything. You could have said, 'My mother has run her own business for 30 years. You could have said, "That workbook is one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen." You could have said nothing and simply reached across and taken my hand. Any of those would have been enough. She was crying by then. I wasn't, but I wasn't far. I said, "I love you. That hasn't changed, and it won't change. But I need you to understand something. I spent my whole life building things quietly because I thought the building was the point, not the acknowledgement. And I still believe that. But there are moments when the person next to you needs to see that you know what they've built. That dinner was one of those moments. And you looked away." She said, "I know." I said, "Okay." We talked for another hour, not about Cecily, not about the wedding, not about the sale, about my mother's singer, about the first dress I ever made her for her grade 8 graduation, which had a sash I'd hand-stitched twice because the first attempt wasn't right, about a fitting she'd sat in on when she was about 7, a bride who had been so nervous she'd started crying, and how I told her that being nervous meant she understood what she was stepping into, and that was the right way to feel. She hadn't remembered that. I had. The workbook is on my kitchen table as I write this. The cover is worn, the way things get when they've been used well and often. I have been thinking about what to do with it. I don't think I'll give it to my daughter. Not yet. Maybe someday, but a gift like that has to land in the right moment, and we haven't gotten there yet. We're getting there. She is trying, in the genuine, imperfect way that people try when they've understood they made a mistake and they want to do better. Her son-in-law. My son-in-law now, since the wedding went ahead in September, at a venue that was very beautiful and that I attended and at which I was cordial to Cecily Drummond Park, and she was cordial back. Because we are both women who understand how to behave in public, he apologized to me privately at the reception, quietly and without anyone around. He said he hadn't understood in the moment what the gift was. He said he understood now. I shook his hand and told him I appreciated that. I meant it. I also meant that it would take time and that actions were going to matter more than any one conversation. He seemed to understand that too. I hope so. As for Cecily, we will have a polite relationship for the rest of our lives, I imagine. She is not a bad person. She's a person who has moved through the world in one way for a very long time and has no reason to examine it. I have no particular interest in being the reason she starts. What I care about is simpler than that. I care that my daughter knows what the workbook is. I care that she knows it wasn't a little craft book. I care that she knows the work, all of it, all 31 years of it was worth doing and worth witnessing, and worth the 11 minutes I sat in the parking lot trying to remember how to walk through a door. I'm 63 years old. I have a studio I still go into 5 days a week. I have clients who trust me with the most important close of their lives. I have a mother's name on a training space in a building where women are learning to make things with their hands. And I have a worn binder on my kitchen table, full of everything I know. That's enough. That has always been enough. I just needed one person in that room to know it too. I've been thinking about what Cecily's comment actually cost her. Not in any dramatic sense. I don't mean she lost something she'll spend the rest of her life mourning. I just mean that in 6 words, she closed a door she didn't know was open. She didn't know that the woman sitting at the far end of her table had built something real and lasting. She didn't know about the building in the glebe, or the clients who'd been coming to me for 20 years, or the women who were going to learn a trade in a space named after my mother. She didn't know any of it, and she didn't ask, and that's how she ended up calling 31 years of careful work darling. That's how it goes, usually. Contempt moves fast. It doesn't stop to gather information first. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that took me longer to work out than it should have. The cost wasn't really Cecily's to pay. She'll be fine. She is fine. She'll go on having opinions about ivory versus cream, and she'll go on being right about things in rooms full of people who agree with her. And the evening will fade from her memory the way evenings like that do, cleanly, without residue. The cost was mine and my daughter's, and it was a cost we'd both been accumulating for a long time without naming it. I had made my life look effortless because I believed effort was private. I had never said to my daughter, "This is hard, and I am doing it anyway, and I want you to see that." I had just done it. Quietly, in the next room, with the door slightly open. And she had grown up understanding that her mother was capable, without fully understanding what capability had required. That's not her fault. That's not even my fault, exactly. It's just what happens when we confuse silence with strength. Real strength, I think, is knowing when to speak. Knowing when the person across from you needs the full picture, not just the finished product. I had given my daughter the workbook, all those pages of everything I'd learned and lost and figured out, but I'd waited 30 years to do it. And even then, I'd wrapped it in tissue paper and set it on a table and hoped she'd understand without me saying a word. She didn't. Not in that moment. She's getting there now. What I know, at 63, is that the people who dismiss what you've built are rarely the ones you need to convince. Cecily didn't need to understand my workbook. What mattered was whether my daughter did, and what mattered even more was whether I had given her enough honesty, enough context, enough of the real story to understand it. I think about Gerald asking me if I was certain. I was certain, not because I wanted to punish anyone, not because the sale would prove something to Cecily or anyone else. I was certain because I was 63 years old, and I had spent my whole life building things for other people to walk into, and it was time to build something I could point to and say, that one was on purpose. That one was a choice I made with full knowledge of what it meant. The workbook is still on my kitchen table. I look at it most mornings, and what I feel when I look at it isn't bitterness about that evening or satisfaction about the sale. What I feel is something quieter than either of those things, something that took a long time to earn and that nobody can call darling. The first thing I remember is the floor, cold tile against my cheek, the smell of lemon polish and something faintly sweet, candle wax maybe, or the lilies someone had left near the altar that morning. I remember thinking, that's odd, I can smell the lilies. And then I thought nothing at all for a very long time. I had gone to St. Andrew's that Sunday the way I'd gone every Sunday for 31 years, coat buttoned, purse on my left arm, arriving early enough to get the third pew from the front, left side, where the morning light comes through the stained glass and lands just so on the wooden floor. My husband Gordon used to say I was the only person he knew who had a reserved seat in a church that didn't have reserved seats. He wasn't wrong. Gordon has been gone for 4 years now, so I go alone. I am 67 years old. I worked as a school librarian for 28 years in Guelph, Ontario. I have a daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is, legally and biologically, even if that word has started to feel strange in my mouth. And I have a grandson, 7 years old, with his grandfather's gap between his front teeth and a laugh that fills up whatever room he's in. That Sunday in February, I sat in my usual pew and I sang the first two hymns, and somewhere in the middle of the third, the room tilted. I thought at first I was simply dizzy. I hadn't eaten much that morning, just half a piece of toast and my tea. And I'd been sleeping poorly for weeks, that restless kind of not sleeping where you lie there fully awake listening to the house settle. I gripped the pew in front of me. The woman beside me, a retired teacher named Gwyneth, who I've known for years, touched my arm and asked if I was all right. I wasn't all right. The paramedics told me later that I went down hard, that Gwyneth caught enough of my shoulder to slow the fall, but not stop it, that the minister stopped mid-sermon and two men from the congregation were beside me within seconds. One of them, a young man I'd never spoken to, home visiting his parents for the weekend, held my hand and kept talking to me even though I wasn't conscious. He told me his name and said I wasn't alone and kept saying it over and over. His name was Kieran. I know that because Gwyneth told me afterward. I've thought about Kieran many times since then. A stranger who held my hand in a church and told me I wasn't alone. I didn't know it yet, but that would turn out to be a theme. The hospital determined I'd had a cardiac event. Not a full heart attack, but serious. A warning, the cardiologist called it, with a particular grimness of someone who has had to deliver this kind of news many times and knows there is no gentle way to do it. There was damage to the heart muscle. I would need monitoring, medication changes, possibly a procedure within the week depending on how my body responded. I would need someone with me. The emergency contact in my phone was my daughter. The nurses tried her first. Then the on-call social worker tried. Then the attending physician tried. By the time I was stable enough to ask questions, I was told they had been calling her for hours. My phone, which had been in my coat pocket when I fell, had been recovered and placed on the table beside my hospital bed. I could see the screen. Missed calls going out. No answers coming back. She has a name, my daughter. I won't use it here. I'll just call her my daughter. And I'll let you sit with the weight of that phrase the same way I'd had to. I lay in that hospital bed and looked at the ceiling tiles and thought about all the times I had answered the phone for her. 3 a.m. when her marriage was falling apart. On my lunch break at the library when she needed me to talk her through something. The day she called crying from a parking lot in Mississauga and couldn't even tell me what was wrong, just needed to hear my voice. I always picked up without even checking the name on the screen, because when you're a mother, you just do. 41 calls. That is the number the nursing staff logged between the paramedics radioing in and the end of that first night. 41 times someone reached out through a phone to my daughter to say, "Your mother collapsed. Your mother is in the hospital. We need someone to be here." She did not answer. On the second day, Gwyneth came. She brought a thermos of actual tea, not the pale hospital version, and a small container of shortbread she'd made herself, and she sat with me for 3 hours and didn't say much, just read her book in the chair by the window and refilled my cup when it got low. I hadn't asked her to come. She just came. She told me she'd called my daughter herself twice and gotten voicemail. She said this quietly, without drama, and then she changed the subject to something her granddaughter had done at skating lessons, and I understood that she was giving me a way not to have to talk about it. I was grateful for that. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until day 3, was where my daughter was. She was in Kelowna. She had apparently planned this trip months in advance. A long weekend with her partner and some friends, wine country, an Airbnb with a hot tub. She mentioned it to me in passing sometime in January, one of our brief, brittle phone calls where we covered logistics but not much else. I'd forgotten. Or maybe I hadn't thought to hold on to it, the way you don't hold on to things that aren't really about you. She posted photos. That's how I know about the hot tub, about the wine, about the long Sunday afternoon that my daughter spent in a lounge chair on a deck in the Okanagan while 41 calls went unanswered. A friend of mine, someone who follows my daughter on social media, which I do not, showed me the photos later, somewhat reluctantly, the way you show someone something that you know is going to hurt them but that they need to see. My daughter was smiling in the photos. She looked relaxed. There was a glass of rosé in her hand and her hair was down and she was laughing at something outside the frame. I did not cry when I saw the photos. I want to be honest about that. I think I had already done something inside myself without quite realizing it, some quiet shift of tectonic plates, and the crying had been used up on something else, some smaller thing, earlier. What I felt when I saw the photos was a kind of settling, the way you feel when you've been waiting for a verdict for a long time and it finally comes and it's the one you'd been afraid of, but also, somewhere, had already known. My daughter knew about the calls. I found that out later, too. She'd seen the missed calls, 41 of them, from numbers she didn't recognize, and then from Gwyneth, whose name she would have known. She'd seen them, and she'd chosen not to call back until the Sunday evening when she was already on the plane home. I didn't want to ruin the trip, she told me. I figured if it was really serious, someone would have found another way to reach me. I've turned that sentence over in my hands many times since she said it. I've tried to find the angle where it makes sense. I haven't found it yet, when she did call. That Sunday night, while I was still in the hospital, while the cardiologist was still talking about whether I'd need a procedure, she was not apologetic in any way I recognized as apology. She asked what had happened. She asked what the doctor said. She asked if I needed her to take time off work. I said no. I said I was being looked after. I said we would talk when I was home. She said okay, and that was mostly the end of it. The person who came to the hospital properly came, stayed for hours came, brought things and sat there came, was a young woman named Daisy. She works with the palliative care program at the hospital. Though I was not a palliative patient, she had come initially to see someone else on my floor and had stopped to check on me at Gwyneth's request. They knew each other somehow, through the church or through the neighborhood. I've lost track of the thread. Daisy was 29 years old and had grown up in Kitchener and had the kind of steady, warm-eyed presence that makes you feel like whatever is happening is survivable. She came back the next day on her own time. She brought fruit and a crossword book and helped me with the first 3 clues before I got too tired and had to stop. She sat there while I slept. When I woke up, she was reading something on her phone and there was a cup of tea on my bedside table, still warm. I asked her why she kept coming. She looked up from her phone and said, "Because you don't have anyone, and that's not okay." I didn't know what to say to that. I think I just nodded. It's the kind of thing that you don't quite absorb when it's said. You absorb it later, in pieces, lying awake at 3 in the morning. I came home after 9 days. Gwyneth had arranged for a neighbor to check on me daily. My doctor set up a visiting nurse for the first 2 weeks. Ade has texted me every morning for a month, nothing elaborate, just, "Good morning, how are you feeling today?" And I'd write back something short, fine or tired or a little better, and she'd write back something that wasn't advice and wasn't pity, just presence. Just the acknowledgement that someone had checked. My daughter came to see me once in those first 2 weeks. She stayed for about 40 minutes. She asked about my medications and looked around my kitchen in a way that made me feel she was cataloging something, though I didn't know what. She asked if I'd thought about whether the house was still practical, whether it was too big for me to manage, whether I'd considered what my options were. I had owned this house for 22 years. Gordon and I had bought it when my daughter was 9. She had grown up in it. She had come home to it after university, after her first job, after the end of her marriage. This house had held all of that. I said I hadn't made any decisions yet. She said, "Well, it's something to think about." And then she checked her phone and left. I sat at my kitchen table after she went, and I looked out the window at the backyard, at the bird feeder that Gordon had put up the spring before he got sick, the one I'd refilled every week since, without thinking much about it. And I thought, she didn't ask once how I was doing, not the medical version. She'd ask that, efficiently, like a checklist. But the other version, the how are you really, how are you sleeping, are you scared, are you lonely, what do you need? She didn't ask. My grandson called me that Thursday. He's 7. He called from his father's house. My daughter and his father had been separated for 2 years, and he told me about a project he was doing at school about polar bears, and said that he wanted to come visit and make me soup, because soup makes you feel better. He'd heard that somewhere. I said soup sounded wonderful. He said he'd ask his dad, his father, I'll call him my son-in-law out of habit, though the marriage is over, is a decent man. We've always gotten along. He called me separately that evening and asked how I was actually doing, and I told him the truth, more truth than I'd told most people, and he listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. He said he was sorry my daughter hadn't been there. He said it simply, not to cause damage, just because it was true and because he thought I needed to hear that someone else saw it. He brought my grandson over that Saturday. The boy made me soup, canned tomato, warmed up on the stove with help from his father, and presented it to me with enormous ceremony, a dish towel tucked into his collar as an apron. I ate 2 bowls. I told him it was the best soup I'd ever had in my life, and I meant it in the way that you can mean something that isn't literally true. After they left, I sat for a long time in the quiet of the house. Something had changed. I could feel it the way you feel weather before it comes. A pressure change, a stillness before the wind picks up. I had been, for most of my daughter's adult life, trying to hold things together between us, apologizing when I wasn't sure what I'd done, softening my words so she didn't pull away, making myself smaller in conversations so there would be room for her feelings, even when mine were also sitting there, taking up space, needing somewhere to go. I had done this for years, quietly, the way women of my generation were taught to manage relationships, with patience and self-erasure and the belief that love meant making yourself less inconvenient. I was tired of being less inconvenient. I am a widow. I have 1 daughter. I live on my pension and the savings Gordon and I built over 40 years of being careful. My house is paid off. I have some money set aside. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough that I have choices, which I sometimes forget, because for a long time my daughter spoke about my finances in a way that made me feel like the choices belonged to her. I had not, before February, written a will. I know. My doctor had asked. Gordon's brother had asked. Even Gwyneth, once, gently. But I had avoided it the way you avoid certain conversations, because putting something in writing makes it real, and I hadn't wanted things to be that real. After my daughter's visit, the 40-minute visit, the one with the kitchen cataloging and the question about whether the house was still practical, I called a lawyer. Her name is Nika. She has an office on Woolwich Street and a directness that I find deeply comforting. We had 3 meetings. I told her everything, more or less. She listened. She asked clear questions. She did not tell me what to do, which I appreciated, but she made sure I understood what my options were and what the implications of each choice would be. I made a will. The house will go to a land trust, a local organization that converts donated properties into affordable housing. I read about them in the Mercury Tribune about 2 years ago, and I've thought about them since. Gordon and I never had much growing up. We knew what it meant to need a place to be and to not have one. I think he would have liked this. The savings, what remains of the savings after my care and my remaining years, which I intend to live fully and without apology, will go partly to a Daisy's program at the hospital, specifically to fund a patient support navigator position so that people who come in alone don't stay alone, and partly to a bursary at the Guelph Public Library for kids from low-income families in Gordon's name. My daughter is not in the will. I want to be honest about this, because I've thought about it carefully and I'm not doing it in anger. I am not an angry person, or at least I try not to be. What I am is clear, finally, after a very long time of being not quite clear enough. My daughter is a capable woman in her early 40s, with a good income and a house of her own and a life that functions without me. She will be all right. She's been all right for a long time without me. She just hasn't always been honest about that. What she has not been is present. Not when I needed her. Not for the 41 calls. Not for the 9 days. Not for the first 2 weeks home. Not really. Not in the way that presence means something. I told her on a Tuesday evening in April what I had done. I had asked her to come over for dinner. I made a roast chicken, her favorite since she was small, and we sat at the kitchen table and I waited until we were finished eating. And then I told her I'd made a will, and I told her what was in it. Calmly, without accusation. The way you deliver information that has been decided and is no longer up for discussion. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that I was punishing her. I said I didn't think of it as punishment. I thought of it as honesty. An honest accounting of who had been here and who hadn't. She said that wasn't fair, that she hadn't known I was that sick, that no one had told her clearly enough. I thought about the 41 calls. I didn't say it. I didn't need to. She said she was my daughter, that she deserved to be considered. I said that I had considered her. I'd thought about nothing else for weeks. But being a daughter is a relationship, not a title. And a relationship requires showing up. And she hadn't shown up. And that was a choice she had made. And choices have weight. And I was asking her to feel that weight. She left without finishing her coffee. She texted me twice that week. Short, hurt messages that I read carefully and responded to carefully. In the second message, she said she needed time. I said I understood. I said I loved her and I meant it. But I also said that love and accountability were not opposites, and that I had given her decades of one without enough of the other, and that I was not doing that anymore. She hasn't responded to that message. It's been 6 weeks. I refilled the bird feeder last weekend. 3 chickadees came within minutes. They always do. They know the feeder. And I stood at the window in my kitchen and watched them and drank my tea and didn't feel lonely the way I thought I would. I thought about Gordon. I thought about Kieran, the young man who held my hand on the floor of St. Taff Andrews and told me I wasn't alone. I thought about Gwyneth and her shortbread and her thermos of tea. I thought about a Daisy who came back on her own time because I don't have anyone, and that's not okay. I thought about my grandson and his canned tomato soup and his dish towel apron and the gap between his front teeth that is exactly his grandfather's gap. His father has started bringing him over on Saturday afternoons, regularly now, without occasion. We do puzzles. I read to him. Last week, he fell asleep on the couch, and his father and I sat at the kitchen table and had actual coffee and talked for almost 2 hours about all kinds of things. The way you talk when you've stopped performing and just started being honest. I am 67 years old. I had a cardiac event in February. My heart has damage and it will always have damage, but it is still working, which is more than I could say for some things in my life that I held on to much longer than I should have. I am learning, late and slowly, the difference between the family you are given and the family that stays. I spent a long time believing that love meant enduring, that loyalty meant not walking away even when staying cost you something. I don't think that anymore. I think love, real love, the kind worth having and worth giving, is made up of ordinary moments of showing up, 41 unanswered calls, or a thermos of tea, a crossword book, a bowl of canned tomato soup with a dish towel for an apron. You know which one is which. I don't know what will happen with my daughter. I hope for something. I'm her mother. I can't help it. Hope is apparently the last thing to go. But I am not waiting anymore. I am not making myself smaller. I am refilling the bird feeder and drinking my tea and letting the people who want to be in my life, and letting the silence from the ones who don't speak for itself. The silence, it turns out, says plenty. I'm still here. Still at the 3rd pew from the front, left side where the morning light comes through the stained glass. Gwyneth sits beside me now. We go for tea after, at the place on MacDonald Street that does the good scones. We talk about small things and occasionally large ones. It's enough, more than enough. It's in fact exactly what I needed all along. I just had to nearly lose everything to finally let myself have it. I've been thinking a lot lately about cause and effect. Not in any grand or cosmic sense, just the plain, ordinary truth of it, that the things we do or don't do leave marks, that every choice we make is also a statement about who we are, whether we intend it to be or not. My daughter made a choice in February, 41 calls, 9 days, and she chose, clearly and deliberately, to let them go unanswered. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I've moved past the part where bitterness was useful. But I do say it clearly, because clarity is something I've had to work hard to find, and I'm not going to soften it now just to make the telling easier. What I've come to understand is that accountability isn't punishment. When I told my daughter what I decided about the will, she said I was punishing her. I understood why she felt that way. But punishment is about causing pain for its own sake. What I did was something different. I simply let her choices have weight. I let the reality of what had happened exist without covering it over with forgiveness that hadn't been earned yet, without smoothing it into something more comfortable for both of us. That's not punishment. That's honesty. And honesty, I've learned, is its own form of respect, even when it's hard to receive. There's something I wish someone had told me 30 years ago when I was still in the middle of raising her and trying to hold everything together, that love without boundaries isn't love. It's just endurance. I endured a great deal. I called it love. I'm not sure it served either of us well. The courage I'm most proud of isn't the will or the conversation at the kitchen table. It's the smaller thing, the daily decision to stop making myself less inconvenient, to stop pre-apologizing for having needs, to stop reading her silences as evidence that I'd done something wrong. That took more out of me than the legal paperwork. That took, if I'm being honest, most of my life to learn. And then there's Gwyneth, with her thermos. Adiz, who came back on her own time because I don't have anyone and that's not okay. Kieran, a stranger who held my hand on a cold tile floor and said I wasn't alone. These people had no obligation to me, no history, or very little. What they had was the simple intelligence to recognize a person who needed something and the decency to offer it. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. I think real wisdom, not the kind in books, but the kind that settles into your body after a long life, is knowing the difference between who is actually there and who you've been telling yourself is there. It took me 9 days in a hospital bed and 41 unanswered calls to finally see that difference clearly. I wish it had taken less, but I'm not sorry it came. I'm still here. I refilled the bird feeder. I have tea with Gwyneth on Sunday mornings. My grandson comes on Saturdays with his father, and we do puzzles, and I read to him, and last week he fell asleep on my couch with his shoes still on. My heart has damage in it, the cardiologist says, but it's working just fine.